Hey y'all, it's Jen and welcome to my channel, Ifra's Inklings. Today's video, I want to talk about the non-fiction books that I have read in 2020. I don't feel like non-fiction books get as much attention as some of the other genres. Since I didn't do any wrap-ups this year, I want to highlight the non-fiction books that I read. So before we get started in this video, be sure and click that subscribe button if you're not already subscribed so you don't miss any more of my future content videos. If you are already subscribed, be sure and double check just to make sure that YouTube hasn't unsubscribed you from my channel. So with that said, let's get into that intro. I have read 21 books that were nonfiction this year. Most of them I listen to audiobooks because I like to listen to nonfiction audio books better than I like to read nonfiction. I just am able to process it a little bit better and stay focused than just reading the book. So my thumbnail that you see is going to be a little off because I realize I actually own 3 additional books of nonfiction than what I show on my thumbnail. So, yeah. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start in January and kind of go through the list of what I read, tell you a little bit about the book and what I thought of it, and what I rated it. I'm going to try and do this quickly so that talking about 22 books of nonfiction is not going to be 3 hours long, but we will see how it goes. So the first book that I read of nonfiction this year or in 2020, was Buttermilk Graffiti by Edward Lee. I gave this one 5 stars. This was a very interesting book. It was kind of a food memoir. Edward Lee goes through different regions talking about the food of that region and that culture and how it differs from, in the American version of it, or Americanized version of it, differs from than where it came from, if it came from another culture outside of the United States, and how the cuisine has kind of evolved, or why it's part of that culture. I found it very interesting. He talks about the areas, the geographical areas where this food is found, in addition to the culture, and why different geographical areas have different foods, and different cultures have different foods. So I found it very interesting. So the next one I read, actually the next 2 kind of go together. So I'm gonna talk about them. I'm gonna talk about them at the same time. So All That Remains, A Life in Death by Sue Black, and then Stiff, The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers by Mary Roach. So these are obviously medical nonfiction books. Mary Roach, who wrote Stiff, is a journalist. She's the investigative journalist. So her book is a little bit different, and she's based in the US. Sue Black is actually in this field of study. She's a medical professional in this field of study in England, I believe, somewhere in Europe. I think she's worked in Ireland and in Scotland, maybe. It's been a long time since I've read the book, but I know she's over in England that area on that continent, not in the U.S. But both of those books talk about the decomposition of the of the human body. They explore body farms and how forensics is used, and how donating your body to science and to body farms, being a human cadaver, helps people, not only medical students, learn about the body, because medical students have to cut up a body before they go in and cut up your body in surgery, you know. So they practice and learn about it on cadavers, the body farms where they have cadavers decomposing in natural elements, help teach about being able to identify how long somebody's been dead, kind of the different aspects, what happens to your body if it's left in the elements. All of that, all of those different elements of death are talked about in these two books. I found them very similar, but in different ways, and they were very interesting. If that's something that you're curious about, I found both of those very interesting and very fascinating. Of course, I could have a little bit of a morbid fascination with death, but again, like I said, I found both of those very interesting. If you like the YouTube channel by Caitlin Daughtery, I never can pronounce her last name right. I want to say Daughtery, but that's not correct. But the mortician something. I'll put it on the screen because I'm drawing a blank here. But if you like her channel, you will be fascinated with those two books. So the next book that I read that was nonfiction was He Wanted the Moon by Mimi Baird, and I gave this one 4 stars just because the content and the way it was written was hard to follow. I read this one just because this follows Dr. Baird, and he was diagnosed manic depressive, bipolar, whatever you want to call it, in the 40s, and he was one of the first people to recognize that bipolar was a condition, and it was a chemical imbalance, and not just crazy, not being possessed by demons. There's been a lot of research throughout this, through the years since he did his initial research, where they have found that mental health issues are usually genetic in some form. And something I don't talk about a lot is that I actually have a bipolar diagnosis, and I am related to Dr. Baird. I'm related to Dr. Baird and Mimi Baird. I haven't figured out the exact family line lineage, but distant cousin would be how we're related, based on some information given in the book, and locations where he is from, and where his parents are from. There's very specific information given that I know that they are part of my family lineage. So I found this book to be extremely fascinating based on that element of things. But like I said, it was a little hard to find. I mean, it was a little hard to follow because the book is, you start out with kind of an introduction from Mimi Baird, and then you go into Dr. Baird's writings. He kept kind of a journal, a diary of what kind of happened when he was institutionalized and when he was in his manic and depressive phases. If you know anything about bipolar disorder, there are different levels of it, and if someone who has severe bipolar disorder and has severe manic episodes. They get almost delusional, and so his writing reflects that, and so it was hard to follow and hard to kind of know what was going on, and you can see the delusional aspects of his writing in it. And then it ends with some more commentary by Mimi Baird, some things that she found that she was able to factualize in Dr. Baird's writings, and kind of piece together some of his mania and kind of what actually happened during that time. And it was hard and interesting at the same time. I mean, the way that they treated people with mental health issues in the early, I think this was 40s and 50s, in the 60s, they did not treat them appropriately. There was, so that was hard to read. But again, like I said, I found it fascinating. The family connections made it even more so, especially knowing that bipolar disorder is suspected to be one of the mental illnesses passed down throughout the genetics. So I don't know that a lot of people would find it as interesting as me, unless you are looking for books about bipolar disorder from the perspective of someone going through the different manic phases and depressive phases, and their writings and that kind of connection. It was hard to follow. Let me just say that it was hard to follow. Okay, so then rounding out January, I finished the month reading An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. I gave this one 4 stars also. The reason it didn't get 5 stars is it was just the writing style of it. The learning about the awful things that the colonizers did to the indigenous people when they landed here and throughout the years of the United States history was just appalling. And coming to the realization that my ancestors, I do have Native American blood distantly, but knowing that, coming to the realization that my great grandmother, who was full-blooded, I believe Cherokee, knowing that she was probably not fully entered into the relationship with my white great whatever grandfather, knowing that she probably wasn't entered into that relationship completely 100% willingly, and that it was not probably 100% honest, was disgusting, honestly. Just very eye-opening. The things that we learn in our history classes in the United States do not equal what truly happened and how it related to the things in this book. The traditions that were stolen from the Native American peoples, the lands, their lives, their people, you know, stolen from them, and the things that we took from them culturally, and that we are taught was something that the colonizers came up with. It was very eye-opening. I mean, I knew that the American history was not 100% authentic, that we're taught. I mean, I knew that the Native American people were not treated the way and represented the way that our history books teach us. I already knew that going in, but the level of which it occurred, and just some of the some of the, like I said, the cultural things that we stole from them to make the United States what it is today was just a very eye-opening and very appalling. And I think everyone should read this book. The reason I gave it 4 stars instead of 5 was because there was a little bit of bias brought into this, which I don't 100% fault the author for, but it was a little bit more biased than a strict nonfiction book should have been. And there were lots of times that information was just repeated, chapter after chapter after chapter. It was repeated, and I don't know that it necessarily needed to be. So the flow of it kind of threw me out of listening to this book, because I thought, we've already learned this. She's already talked about this. It's like repeated exactly word for word what was said in previous chapters. And so that kind of threw me out of the flow of the book. Moving on to February, I read 2 nonfiction books that month. The first one was Tinderbox by Robert W. Fieseler, I believe is how you say it. This book was about the club in New Orleans that burned. It was a gay club in the 1970s that burned to the ground, and it was intentionally set, and a lot of people lost their lives that day. A lot of people were outed because of the fire that weren't out. In the 70s were not a safe time to be out as a homosexual individual, and so it caused a lot of heartache and strain for the families, and it wasn't investigated as it should have been because it was a gay club. And I think I'll leave it at that. It was very informative, very heart-wrenching, and part of kind of of gay history that is not talked about or taught or learned about. So it was eye-opening, for sure. It's also told very well. Listening to it was more like listening to a story instead of a nonfiction tell of events. It also talks a lot about different things that have occurred in the gay history, such as the shooting at the nightclub in New Orleans, and I can't think of the name right off the top of my head. Not New Orleans, in Orlando. That mass shooting that happened a few years ago, and then it talks about kind of the first pride parades that happened, some things that happened in California. It kind of all relates it back to this event. Well, it looks like I'm losing lighting. I'm going to try and hurry up through this because I'm only in February. The next book that I listened to was The Mercy of the Sky by Holly Bailey, and this talks about the Moore, Oklahoma tornado that took the lives of the elementary students. It hit 3 different elementary schools in the middle of the day. Kind of blew up out of nowhere. The El Reno tornado that took the lives of the 3 storm chasers is talked about a little bit because it happened just a few days later. And then there was another F5 tornado that happened right around that same time as well, that it briefly mentions. But this one is specifically the Moore tornado, the F5 tornado that impacted Moore, Oklahoma, and just devastated the community. Again, I have a personal connection to that. I have a cousin that lived in Moore, Oklahoma. I've actually got my great aunt, and I have a great aunt and uncle that live in just outside of Oklahoma City. And one of their children, they've got 3 children. One of their children at the time lived in Moore, and her home, my cousin Teresa's home, was completely demolished. The only thing left standing was the bathtub, which her and her son were in. So I have a personal connection to that book too, and that tornado. But this one was told really well told. It was fascinating. I am fascinated with weather. one of my other side hobby interests is weather, and so I found it just extremely interesting to me. I gave it 5 stars. And if you want to learn more about that tornado and kind of tornadoes and forecasting in general, I highly recommend you listen to that book or read it or pick it up. So in March, I only read one nonfiction book, and that was Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski, I believe is how you pronounce it. This book is about sexuality and how, I don't even know how to explain this book. It's really about sexuality, about sex, about women and orgasms and how we achieve those. It's kind of, and how throughout the years that women's sexual health and sexual satisfaction is kind of been looked down upon, and it needs to be explored more, and both individually and with a partner. I found it interesting. I don't know that I would have picked that book up on its own had I not been needing it for a prompt, but for a Pop Sugar challenge, and I found it fascinating. And I think I will pursue that topic in future nonfiction books as well. So in April, I didn't read any nonfiction books. In May, so I've got 4 books in May that I read, which I think I actually forgot to tally one of these in my initial count. So maybe I read 22 books, nonfiction books in 2020. Anyway, so the first one that I'm going to talk about is Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. This is actually a memoir. I did not know that when I picked this book up. I thought it was just one of her fiction books, middle grade fiction books, but it's not. This is a memoir that tells about her life growing up as a young black child. It talks about her living with her father in the northern United States, and how living in the North and in the community they were in, they were not, did not experience some of the racial, not discrimination, what's the word? Prejudices that she experienced when she visited her grandmother in the South. And then they lived with her grandmother for a little while. It talks about that experience. And then they moved to New York City with her mother later on when she was, I think, a teenager, and how that experience was as well. Talks about kind of the segregation, desegregation issues, prejudiceness in the South, what it was like growing up black. And I found it to be very interesting to read from this perspective. It's also written in prose. So I listened to the audiobook version of this, so I didn't get the same feel of the prose writing style as if I would have read it, but I really enjoyed it, and I highly recommend that you pick up this book. Again, like I said, it's a memoir written in prose about Jacqueline Woodson's childhood. And if I didn't say it before, I did give this one 5 stars. So the next one, this next book is an biographical graphic novel, and that's Mouse by Art Spiegelman, and this is the complete Mouse, so it's volumes 1 and 2. The first volume is about Art interviewing his father, trying to get to know his father more and learning more about his father's time in the concentration camps and during the Nazi Germany reign, as a Jewish man. And then the last portion of the book is after his father's death. So, and it still talks about kind of what his father went through and how it's affected his life. And it just, man, it's hard. It took me so long to get through this, almost a year, just because I could read a couple of these pages and then I had to put it down because of the emotional level of it. I read a lot of World War II type books, but I think that this being in the graphic novel format made it more difficult and felt more personal because of the drawings and the artwork of it, of the storytelling process. But I highly recommend it. I gave it 5 stars. Then I read Infinite Tuesday, an autobiographical riff by Michael Nesmith. If you don't know who Michael Nesmith is, he was one of the members of the Monkees back in the 70s. I was a huge fan of them. Obviously, I was watching it in syndication because it was no longer on air when I was, in the early 80s when I was watching it. But I love the Monkees. I have their box cassette set somewhere around here. I have seen Joey in concert. He performed in 1999 at Disney, and I was there at Disney for New Year's. I love this. I loved the Monkees, the TV show, and the Monkees as the band. Learning his story was really interesting. Things I didn't know about him. His mother invented whiteout, which that was pretty cool. He also talks about his spiritual journey. This has some heavy religious commentary in here. I am not a religious person, and I did not find it overbearing. I found it interesting how it related to making Michael Nesmith the person he was, and it really involved heavily on his mother. His mother made him the person he is, and she was a very religious person. So, there was some really cool things though that I learned about Michael Nesmith that I didn't know before, and his journey. He is a really fascinating person. He had a really interesting life. And so if you are interested in that type of learning about it, he's a musician, but he's done so much more. He's really big into helping women and musicians. It talks about some of the foundations, a couple of the foundations his mother founded, and then he's carried on, and why those are important. Very, very interesting story. I'll just leave it at that, because I think it's a journey you need to go on if you want to learn more about Michael Nesmith, and if you enjoyed the Monkees, and even if you don't know who the Monkees are and not interested in them or whatever, just the journey he went on in his life, and it was a journey, let me tell you. It was really fascinating. So I do recommend this book. It's a really cool cover too. There is, I found on Hoopla, I guess there's music that goes along with this, because there's this in an autobiographical riff that was just like an hour long. I did listen to the audiobook of this too, so there is an audiobook, but this was something different, and I need to go listen to it because I think it has some of his music in it. Michael Nesmith was a folk song writer, musician. It's not really, and he was the only member of the band that had any musical talent when they signed up for the TV show The Monkees. So I found all of that very interesting. But anyway, I gave this 5 stars, and thought it was well told and a fascinating story to kind of travel down. So the next one that I read was also autobiographical graphic novel, and that was Happily Ever After by Debbi Tung. She wrote another graphic novel that I read first about being an introvert in a noisy world, and I just love her art style, and I can relate to her so much. This is the continuation of of her first graphic novel. The first one kind of focused on living as a single person and kind of starting to date and dating as an introvert. And then this book, The Happily Ever After, was after her and her boyfriend got married and what it's like to live with a married, and be part of a married couple as an introvert. And I enjoyed it a lot. Okay, we're moving on to June. We're just going to listen to the sirens in the background because I live in the city and this happens. And my light's almost gone, so we got to get through this last half of the year. So in June, I read 2 nonfiction books. The first one was Robin by David Itzkoff. This is the biography of Robin Williams, and when I tell you, I sobbed so hard at this. I sobbed. I sat down in my floor and I cried for about 30 minutes listening to this audiobook. I knew it was going to be a hard one. I've been putting it off and putting it off because Robin Williams he was always an actor that I really loved. I've loved all of his movies. One of the things when his death was announced was just the outpouring of the people that knew him and that was close to him, how much he truly affected their lives, and that was so touching. This book touches on that a little bit. This was written after his death, so it does address some of that. If you're like Robin Williams, if you're interested in his story, his struggles throughout the year, where he came from, how he got to where he was, and ultimately what was going on that caused him to feel like suicide was the only way out, then definitely pick this book up. Like I said, it was hard. It was an emotional read. It goes through his and it goes through his movie biography too. It talks about his different movies he's been in and why he did those roles and how those roles kind of affected the person he was. It's very good. David Itzkoff is a journalist. It's told in a very journalistic way, I guess is the right way for it, but it's very easy to follow and very informative, and it flows very well. There's not a lot of repeat. It chronicalizes his entire life from birth to death. So highly recommend. I gave it 5 stars. The final book for June that I read was Energy, A Human History by Richard Rhodes, and this book talks about energy of humans that we've created. It starts, it goes through the wood burning phases to us discovering coal, to natural gas and electricity and nuclear power. It goes through the history of all of that. Steam energy, water, hydro energy. All in all, it was very fascinating. It kind of talks about what the best types of energy there are and the pros and cons of clean energy, including solar and wind energy, and hydro energy, what's good about it, the benefits to it, and the cons of it. Because even things like wind energy that is natural and a lot greener than coal and natural gas, there are still cons to all of them. And it was interesting to learn about our history from day one, as far as how we have learned, what we used to learn, what we used to use to produce energy, and how it's transformed over the years to where we are today. Okay, so July was another 0 nonfiction month. In August, I read 2 nonfiction books, and the first one of those was Sold by Patricia McCormick. This is a story about the slave trade, sex trafficking trade of Nepal. And it tells one girl's story of being sold by her stepfather into sex trafficking. And it's hard to read. It is a hard story to comprehend, especially because this is still going on today in those areas. This is not own voices. Patricia McCormick, she's telling the story of other women that have gone through this. It also tells at the end what resources there are that you can help get these women out of this situation, and what they are doing to help these women that are in these situations. Go into that knowing that it's going to be hard to read. It is graphic. They don't mince words here. What's happening to our main character, who is 13, is told in very graphic details. So, know that going into it. I gave it 5 stars. The final book in August that I read was The Ends of the World by Peter Brennan. This is a book about the end of the world. What's going to happen, climate change, and that kind of thing. Where we came from and how we've gotten to where we are now, where we're headed if we don't make changes, and what life is going to look like. And it also talks about what would happen if we do make changes and help prevent climate change from getting worse. I found this book a little dry. I mean, it was a little dry. It was also a little terrifying and fascinating at the same time. It just kind of reiterates that humans are awful and we are killing our planet. In September, I only read one nonfiction book, and that was Trans Like Me by C.N. Lester. And this book is a memoir about being trans and how the trans community is still not embraced as much and in the same ways as we embrace the other aspects of the LGBTQIA plus communities. The trans community and trans members are still targeted and harmed and not taken seriously, and just all kinds of ways that we are still failing our trans community, and also ways that we can help. You know, what language to use, what resources are needed, and just how to be better allies to our trans community. So highly recommend that. It is obviously its own voices, and C.N. Lester has written several other books on the topics that pertains to the trans community. Obviously, I gave it 5 stars. So in October, I read 2 nonfiction books. I started off the month with Hunting of Charles Manson, The Quest for Justice in the Days of Helter Skelter by Liz Weil. And this is literally the book about Charles Manson. I mean, it talks about Charles Manson's boyhood, what made him the person he was, how he recruited people to his cult, goes through the murders, and then it also it talks a lot about Helter Skelter, if you've read the book Helter Skelter. So if you've read Helter Skelter, this is pretty much mostly the account of what happened at the trial and the murders themselves. This is written by the prosecutor of the Helter Skelter case, the murders of the 2 murders that really brought Charles Manson into light. And I can't think of the names of them right now, but all I'm thinking of is Helter Skelter. But if you are familiar with Charles Manson, you know the story, you know the crimes he's committed. So this book, Hunting Charles Manson, kind of goes a little bit more in depth. It talks about his life before, kind of his crime spree. Not that this is an excuse or justification, but he had a pretty crappy childhood and young adult life. And all of that, you can see how that influenced the person he became. It also goes into a little bit in depth of his followers, the main ones that were part of the murders. It talks about them and their life and what brought them to be able to be influenced and put under the control of a person like Charles Manson. And then it picks up where this leaves off, because again, this kind of ends at the convictions of Charles Manson and his followers that were involved, where this one continues on and talks about life after the conviction and their appeal process. Charles Manson's children, he had several, and then kind of what happened to Charles Manson. It even includes his after he was dead. He recently died a few years ago, and it talks about the process and who claimed his body and kind of what that process was and kind of where things stand today. Talks about the appeals processes that all of the members have gone through and all of that. So I found this one interesting. None of it was new information to me, because I have been following Charles Manson since I was a teenager. I think 9th grade was when I read Helter Skelter, this book here, and I've been fascinated with Charles Manson ever since. I found this one very fascinating, was well told, and I gave it 5 stars. And then I read this book. This is The Great and Only Barnum by Candace Fleming. This is a young adult middle grade biography of P.T. Barnum. I thought it was told really well. Jillian actually read it as well and found it very interesting. I know that P.T. Barnum is maybe not the best character. He comes with a lot of controversy. And some of it I don't know is 100% warranted. So I found this biography very interesting. I'd like to maybe read a biography about him that's not geared towards children, but this one had some very interesting aspects to his life, kind of how he became who he was, how he cared for the people that worked for him, and how he was perceived around the world. Like I said, I found it interesting. I thought it was told very well. I did give it 5 stars. Jillian really enjoyed it. She read it in about 30 minutes. It took me several months. But it has pictures in it. And it goes through P.T. Barnum's, from his life, childhood, all the way through his death. It's not very long, but like I said, I found it fascinating, and it was well told and interesting. So in November, I have read 2 nonfiction books. I started off the month listening to Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition by Daniel Okrent. I gave it 3.5 stars because it was kind of dull. It was almost 20 hours of an audiobook, and it went through about 8 years of the start of kind of where Prohibition got started and the concept of it, and all the way through the end of Prohibition. And it was so political. Duh, I don't know why I thought it wouldn't be political, because it's about Prohibition. But I was reading it right about the time that we were going through the election here in the United States, and I was overwhelmed with politics as it was. And this was so heavily political in this book about Prohibition that I was drained listening to it and going through it, and it took me forever to get finished with it. I did learn some things. I did find some aspects of it very interesting, but I'm glad it was over. And like I said, it was kind of dry. It repeated a lot of the same things throughout the chapters. The flow of the story, it didn't flow very well. It kind of hopped back and forth, and there were times when I was like, who the hell, you know, where the hell did this come from? You know, because it was like we would jump from one aspect of Prohibition, one year, one era, one whatever, into something different, and sometimes we would jump forward, sometimes we would jump backwards, and it just, like I said, it didn't flow well. So I gave it 3.5 stars, and I'm glad I never have to read anything about that again. And then I read this book. Actually, I listened to the audiobook of it. This is The Family Romanov by Candace Fleming. She also wrote the P.T. Barnum book. This one is geared not towards young adults and middle grade, though. It is an adult biography of the Romanov family. I've kind of always been fascinated with the Romanov family because who wouldn't be? Their story is very interesting. Romanov as a ruler was so completely out of touch, as most leaders of countries are. The political uprising that the Romanov family went through was interesting. And then, of course, Rasputin. I mean, that character is fascinating. If you don't know the story, check into it. I also did learn that what we learned about Rasputin, as far as his death, wasn't accurate. It's kind of sensationalized, but I still found it fascinating. Rasputin was one of those characters that kind of almost cultish. He was very charismatic and almost cult-like following. Definitely a cult-like following. Just fascinating. Anyway, fascinating characters. But the story of the rise and fall of the Romanovs is a very interesting story to me. And we got that. It's also very sad because the kids, they kill the kids and stuff. But I enjoyed it. I gave it 5 stars. If you're interested in the Romanovs, I think this is a good story. It tells you, it goes a lot more in depth than some of the other Romanov stories that I have learned about. I actually learned a lot from this that I didn't know before. Okay, guys, so this is me coming in at the end because I realized that there was definitely at least one book that I didn't talk about that I knew I read as I was kind of going over in my mind, and somehow I missed this book in August. I read Hood Feminism by Mackie Kendall. I gave this one 5 stars. I found it extremely fascinating and compelling and informative about how the difference between white people feminism and what true feminism would be, intersectional feminism, and how we can be better feminists by helping the black community, black women specifically, not in general, but and how white feminism really differs from complete feminism and how it excludes black women and other women of color. So I highly recommend that one. I read it kind of based on the suggestion of Books in Lala. When she was talking about it, I made note of it, and I've heard multiple people talk about it. She's just the one I think I heard about it first, and it was really a good description of what it was about. Again, very much one that everybody needs to pick up and read so that we can help be better feminists to our black women and the community at large, because we can't be good feminists if we're not including all women. That is all that I have read currently. I hope you enjoyed me combining all of these into kind of one big wrap-up. As always, you can follow me on Goodreads and on Storygraph. I will link my links down below, but I do always try and at least give a star rating to every book that I read on those 2 platforms. Let me know a nonfiction book that you read. As you can see, I read a wide variety of nonfiction, and I'm definitely looking to read more more or the same amount of nonfiction in 2021. So if you have enjoyed this video, please let me know by giving me a thumbs up and give me some suggestions, as I said, about nonfiction books that I need to check out in the future. Also, what you're going to see on the screen now is a playlist to some of my past wrap-up videos, and then also a video that YouTube has suggested for you that they think you will enjoy. So be sure and check that one out as well. And until next time, thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you later.